Without further ado, I'm so glad to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Kat Edgley, Dr. Xander Evans, Gabe Kohler, and Sarah Davenport. Kat is an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University. She is a wildfire social scientist interested in how communities navigate wildfire adaptation, with research under this umbrella that spans pre-fire planning and risk mitigation, evacuation, and recovery. Xander is the executive director at the Forest Stewards Guild. Prior to his current role, his experience included over a decade as the Guild's research director and cartographer and spatial analyst with the USGS. His research supports on-the-ground implementation of ecological forestry and fire management. Gabe is a consulting forester and owner of Renew Forest Works, LLC. He holds a master's in forest ecosystems and society from Oregon State University. Gabe has a strong interest in the human dimensions of natural resource management and seeks to develop forest and fire management that strengthens the connection between rural communities and the forest lands that surround them. And finally, Sarah is a human dimensions specialist at the Ecological Restoration Institute. She holds a bachelor's and master's in forestry from Northern Arizona University. Her research focuses on wildfire social science, collaborative governance, and forest restoration. We are really glad to have everyone join us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Kat.
Hi everyone. Really great to see everyone here and recognize a lot of names from some of these elements of this project. So great to have you all with us. Today we're going to talk as quickly as we can about a really big project that's been 4 years in the making, funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, to try and kind of develop more of a foundation from a science perspective on human-caused wildfire prevention in Arizona and New Mexico. So before we get too far into this, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about when we say fire prevention in this presentation, what we're talking about. So it's often referred to as the three E's and the A, but we have a fire prevention triangle. And this is basically an overview of different approaches to fire prevention. So we have engineering, that's things like developed campsites, campfire rings that modify human behavior. We have enforcement, which is restrictions, fire bans, patrols, things like that. And then we have education, Smokey Bear, the kind of classic education stuff, K through 12 education. And then all of this is tied together by the administrative kind of threads working behind the scenes. And there is a little bit of kind of back and forth about what prevention does and doesn't entail. Some folks also include fuels treatments and firewise work in that. In this presentation today, we'll focus more on things that prevent the ignition in the first place rather than other elements of it. Oops. So what do we know about fire prevention and especially for the Southwest from a science perspective? There's a growing body of literature on this topic, and there's a study that everyone often goes back to from 2010 that shows that every dollar spent on fire prevention saves about $35 in suppression and losses. So we already know that prevention is a good, a fiscally responsible investment, and it's worth our time. One of the challenges related to that, though, is that we don't necessarily have a huge staff to do that work with. It's about 4% of the Forest Service's fire employees are prevention. So that gives you a little bit of a feel. It's a small but mighty group. And then they're backed up by a pretty aging body of literature. When we did a lit review a couple of months ago, we looked at all the best practices information out there. And a huge amount of the kind of specific technique research is from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So we're working with a lot of research on how to conduct fire prevention that's pretty old. So the project we're going to talk about today has a few different elements to it. Our first objective was to bring in kind of a overview of where the Southwest is at right now when it comes to fire prevention with a GIS piece. and some interviews with as many regional staff as we could get who had responsibilities related to fire prevention. The second objective was kind of getting on the ground and figuring out, well, what kinds of prevention strategies are well received by the public and what do we know about those? So we got a few case studies. And then the third objective was kind of outreach around that. And you'll see along the bottom, we had this interaction, this feedback with some of the Region 3 fire prevention folks and different leadership from different agencies who had input on this project throughout. So we often chose research locations in partnership with them or design projects with their input, which is why we call this project a science management partnership. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to touch on the first four here. We've got the GIS piece, the interviews, the surveys with recreationists, and one of our case studies. So I'll hand it over to Zander to get us started.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to talk briefly about the geospatial analysis, so you can go ahead to the next slide, Kat. So we used a great database that Karen Short puts together for the U.S. Forest Service out of the Missoula lab, and it covers the whole country. We focused in on the Southwest, but it's a really rich data source for information on wildfire ignitions, where, when, and in many cases, the cause. So this particular image shows recorded ignition points for firearms, fireworks, recreation, and smoking. And so we thought, okay, there's a great database out here. How can we use this to inform some of the rest of our research? So go ahead to the next slide. And we know from existing research that human ignitions are not random. So we did some preliminary sort of pilot work that confirmed things like proximity to roads, proximity to recreation areas, the wildland urban interface, all are important for determining where human ignitions show up. But we wanted to go deeper. Go ahead to the next slide, please. And the first thing we did was say, okay, well, what are the hot spots? Because we want to use those kind of clusters of where we're seeing human ignitions to target some of the social science research. So this is the first step in our geospatial analysis, and you can see areas like around Flagstaff or in New Mexico around the Jemez areas where we just have this cluster of recreation ignitions. So that was the first piece that helped us decide where to do some of the interviews that folks will be talking about in a minute. Next slide, please. Then we went on to look at, okay, what can the spatial patterns tell us about the ignitions? And the whole time as we looked at this, we weren't thinking just in the abstract, but rather what can these patterns tell us that will actually help prevention? So that was important to have that link to prevention specialists in the Southwest to keep us on track to say, okay, it's great that human ignitions tend to be at a lower elevation, but how can we use that for prevention? Go ahead to the next slide, please. And a good sort of example of how we dug into this was when ignitions happen. So in the upper part of this graph, you can see the natural ignitions, basically lightning, occur in the summer in the Southwest. Not a big surprise. That's when we get our thunderstorms rolling through, lightning ignitions. And so that, if you just look at that top part of the graph, you can see that the natural ignitions kind of swamp out the patterns in the human ignitions. So when we drill down just to the human ignitions, we see, maybe not surprisingly, that Memorial Day and July 4th pop up as big common days or common periods for ignitions. And this gets a little complicated, right? Because they fall on different days, well, at least Memorial Day falls on a different day, different years. So we looked at weeks. But this begins to show that we can use these data to help prevention officers really focus in and say, okay, that's Memorial Day, July 4th. That's when we need people out in the woods. And that may be verifying their experience, their common sense, but it is nice to have data to back those up. So go ahead to the next slide, please. The next thing we did was to say, okay, can we take all this data about where and when ignitions are occurring in the Southwest and try to tease out some other information about these patterns? And because the data is complicated, we used a tool, a statistical tool called classification and regression trees that is robust to things like whether things are normally distributed or whether the data's errors are normally distributed, and whether there's spatial autocorrelation, things like that. So because our data had some unusual characteristics or maybe not normal characteristics, we use this tool that was not affected by those changes. So we don't have to go into the details here, but essentially it becomes like a decision tree to try to split out the data in ways that are intelligible, but also effective. So you can see, you have this little example of if you have a mixed group of red and blue and you're trying to split it out into what determines whether something is red or blue. And at each of those sort of splits is a variable. Go ahead to the next slide. So the results of this, again, kind of are a good confirmation of what we suspected going in. And the data gets split pretty quickly on time. So splitting out before and after the summer as likely human caused. And then when we look at during the summer, again, it's close to campsites. That was the variable that really drove this. So that's helping us understand if you're going to put prevention officers out to try to curtail human-caused ignitions, thinking about during those summer periods, focusing in on campsites is going to be a good way to do it. When we brought this information to our manager team to get feedback and to think about how we could be more effective with this data, they had some really good insights. And so go ahead to the next slide. One of the things they said was, hey, look, we have these response units across the Southwest. And so what does the ignition data look like as we hone in, not just across the Southwest in general, but say Phoenix versus Eastern New Mexico? And we realized in this kind of science management partnership that prevention officers aren't thinking or making plans just on the Southwest in general, but really on their dispatch unit. So go ahead to the next slide. You're not probably going to be able to read all the details here, but the reason I put it up is what it shows in that sort of rainbow set of bar charts at the bottom is that the different dispatch units have very different distribution of causes, human ignition causes. So you can look, there's that large red bar, and that's in Phoenix, where arson is a big issue for human-caused ignitions. And it's not so much in other dispatch units. So that's going to drive maybe different kinds of campaigns, a different focus. We can look at that tall yellow bar in the second category there. So that's debris and open burning. So in that dispatch unit, campaigns that are focused around open burning, maybe in the spring as people are preparing fields, are going to be more effective than just saying, oh, we're going to focus on the same thing across all the dispatch units. So I think that might be my last slide. Is that right, Kat? Oh, no, I got one more. Yeah. So this is another example of how when we change our analytical frame to that which is most useful for the prevention officers, we see different information. So this is just a subset of those dispatch units. And what I wanted to kind of draw your attention to is the top three causes is different in each of those dispatch units. And we can see that recreation, and it's labeled in the database as recreation and ceremony, but recreation is a top cause in many of the dispatch units, but not in all of them. So we see that third one down, debris and open burning again is the top cause. And so that's going to help. And I was actually just emailing with some prevention folks this morning, kind of checking in to see whether this data had been useful to them. And they reported that yes, knowing what some of these key causes for their dispatch unit was informing their planning. So I guess the two things I'll leave you with as we turn it over to the next segment are one, there's great data available. So collecting this data every year, knowing the causes of these wildfires is really important. And having that management science connection can help us focus on the right questions. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Gabe to talk about the next piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Xander. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the interviews that we conducted with Region 3 prevention staff. Prevention is, of course, embedded within agencies, and so it's helpful to talk with these practitioners about how prevention is, programmed in their agency. And so we spoke with representatives from the BLM, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Forest Service. Prevention staff, of course, about their programs. These staff members were at varying levels from kind of district level prevention technicians from the Forest Service all the way up to more regional representatives for organizations like the National Park Service or BIA, for example. And so we were able to get a variety of different perspectives at different scales and kind of levels of management. We conducted 31 interviews, as I said, across the two states. Next slide, please. And so what I want to share is just some of the themes that arose. These were, of course, as I mentioned, semi-structured interviews. And then we went through, kind of standard procedure for coding these interviews. They were transcribed and then coded, and we looked for themes that arose across all of the different interview transcripts. And a lot of what we saw, I'll talk first about this idea of kind of varying prevention needs. Across the interviews, there was different definitions of what constitutes prevention. And I think Kat mentioned this originally when we were kind of honing in on our subject for today that, some folks were thinking of things like Firewise or, wildfire risk reduction treatments as part of prevention. And other folks, were very clear that that was not, falling in the definition of what prevention entails. So really just some definitions in that what we consider to be wildfire prevention. We also saw differentiation in the position descriptions that were used for hiring and the qualifications that were required for different prevention staff, whether it be, kind of more leaning towards wildfire suppression experience, or more towards kind of a social communication background in those position descriptions. So some variation there. Across many of the interviews, we heard about kind of the limitations in tools and funding that were allotted to prevention staff. And of course, a strong emphasis on education within prevention. And this kind of ties back into, kind of classic Smokey Bear approaches, but that role of education in our prevention programs. Next slide, please. Another theme that arose was kind of this piece about the data and the dollars of wildfire prevention. And I just want to touch on the fact that it's really important to note that the majority of ignitions in that data set that Xander was working with are unknown. So there's this classification in there for when we don't have an attributed cause. And that has to do with, how we track ignition data, which is kind of under the purview of prevention. So there was a conversation about training folks to use what's called Inform, which is a database or a process to kind of categorize ignitions. And so we want to kind of improve that quality of data. That was one thing that came forward from a lot of the interviews, was just this unknown category, and how that affects the ability to evaluate the success of prevention programming. Um, Related to that, attributing a cause to wildfires, was the note from our interviewees about the lack of fire investigators. There's a huge kind of there's not a lot of fire investigators to begin with, and then the fire investigators that we do have expressed, kind of the difference between how they were trained in the, NWCG courses, and then their actual responsibility with what they're faced with when they get out on the ground. And so lots of conversation about kind of this data piece from our interviewees and this theme here. This unknown category, the role of fire investigation in that. And then finally, the third part of this theme that came up quite frequently was the utilization of this new tool, the WPSAPs tool. And this tool is a wildfire prevention spatial analysis tool that allows prevention technicians and kind of leaders to use a geospatial data interface to plan their programs out. How many school visits are they going to do a year? How many patrol personnel are they going to need during the fire season, etc. And so this wildfire planning spatial analysis tool, WPSAPs, was talked about as a way of kind of supporting better use of the prevention data to plan programs, in a local geographic unit. There were some challenges there of like, how do you integrate kind of the type of variation that Xander mentioned? Each of these response units has a different kind of flavor of ignition profile, and the WPSAPs tool was described as being maybe a little bit less receptive to those kind of local knowledges or those kind of local considerations. I think the tool is continually being developed, and they're in testing and kind of refining those kinks out. But we did hear about some of the kind of early perceptions of the WPSAPs tool, which was an interesting kind of intersection between managers and the role of a scientist that we were playing for our research. So it helped to kind of inform some development there. The third theme was just kind of this idea that prevention is embedded within the larger preparedness frameworks for the Forest Service. And some of the other land management agencies, that was not the case. So there was a distinction there between Forest Service and other agencies. But this idea that prevention, at least in the case of the Forest Service, was kind of, in tension with suppression resources, that there was needs to advocate to fire management officers for the budget each year, and there's being some challenges to articulate the value of prevention without that data. So just, how do you kind of account for the value of prevention without being able to show easily the wildfires that it prevented? So that cost avoidance piece is really tricky to tease out with the data. And then, of course, there being differences in kind of how these prevention staff were, how their programs are set up, across agencies. So the Forest Service has fire prevention technicians, which are at a very local level. Other agencies had more of a regional approach to their planning and their programming. For the Forest Service, many of the representatives said that there wasn't a lot of advocacy beyond that local level, beyond the ranger district. And that created a challenge for the prevention programming in the Forest Service. Next slide, please. And then finally, the fourth theme I want to mention today is just this idea of prevention as being, along with being underfunded, it being essentially kind of undervalued. This came up a lot. Just understaffed, underfunded. There not being a lot of opportunity for mobility or advancement. The GS structure, at least within the Forest Service, and I think it was the case within the BLM. Some of this has changed since we've done interviews actually in real time, which is good to see. But there just being challenges with upward mobility in the prevention discipline. A lot of folks that are kind of working at the ranger district level, around the GS7 level, and not seeing a clear way for them to advance. And that having kind of an effect on morale and kind of the way that they are situated within the broader fire management organization. Them, not feeling like they're adequately resourced and shouldering responsibility for, this preventative aspect of the work, but not being funded for that. Next slide, please. And I think all of these just kind of point to, this difficulty innovating in the prevention field. There being, a challenge without strong data to show the value of these prevention programs. And then without showing the value of these prevention programs, there's like limited funding. So there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg kind of challenge that we're faced with here, a bit of a paradox that they're underfunded. They don't have the data to show that they're being effective, so they're continuously they can be kind of not as funded as they could be. Again, some of this has changed. I know that there has been more investment in fire prevention. There's started to be more of a kind of forest level, leadership role in the Forest Service and more regional roles within the BLM. It's always kind of been that way with the BLM. But a lot of this has contributed to kind of a brain drain. We've seen folks from Region 3 moving to different areas in the country to reach higher levels of, GS level positions or higher paid positions. I think there's been lots of conversation regionally about how to address that, but to kind of support better outcomes here in the Southwest, there's lots of conversation from our interviewees about the need to, build internal literacy around prevention with our fire management officers, with our kind of regional and state level leads with the BLM or Park Service or BAIA, so that the leadership level understands what the challenges are that prevention technicians are faced with at the local level. And there's better support for those programs, and we can build the data that we need to kind of advocate for more investment in those programs. And so this is some of what we heard. We had a lot of really good discussion here, and I think we've already started to see some of this be landing in the right hands regionally. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A about how this has kind of spun off into action, but I'll pass it off to Sarah next.
All right. Hi, everyone. This brings us to the survey portion of this project. We looked at how public land users felt about prevention strategies in the Southwest and how they engaged with different types of fire-related information. Everything I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so has been published in the Journal of Forestry. So we'll drop a link in the chat, but if you're interested in this work, there's a lot more information in that paper. Next slide, please. So early in the webinar, we talked about some geospatial analysis to identify these hotspots, and this process really helped inform our study areas. We ended up surveying on the Flagstaff Ranger District on the Coconino, the Jemez on the Santa Fe, and the Camino Real on the Carson. Not only were there high incidences of human-caused ignitions in these areas, they also gave us a bit of a recreation spectrum. So, for example, the Flagstaff Ranger District is a bit more urban than the Jemez, so the actual recreation experience might look a bit different between the two. Next slide, please. So we developed a survey instrument that covered a range of topics, but today I'm going to be talking about some of our findings related to intended visitation, engagement with fire-related information, and perceived effectiveness of prevention strategies. We hung out at each of these ranger districts for 10 days to conduct intercept surveys, which basically means that we spoke to everyone we saw recreating and invited them to participate. We staged at key areas, so places like trailheads, campgrounds, and day use areas. But we also wanted to seek out a representative sample, so we made sure to stage at areas that were less popular to intercept folks that were seeking a quieter recreation experience. And to those folks, I'm sorry I found you anyways, and thank you for taking our survey. So in total, we received 739 responses, about 300 from Flagstaff and Jemez each, and 110 from Camino Real. Next slide, please. So about 30 to 40% of folks weren't accessing any fire-related information. So there's definitely room to grow and continue working to increase the visibility of this type of info. And for the majority of folks that were accessing this type of information, they're doing so during the trip preparation phase. Most folks aren't checking on these things during their trip. So for folks coming in from out of town, which make up a large proportion of the surveyed folks and public land users in general, thinking about communicating this type of information ahead of their travel, meeting them where they're at is important. Likewise, we know that conditions are rapidly changing. There's a lot of Mays and Junes in the Southwest when fire restrictions and active incidents are changing on the daily. So it's important that folks have at least a basic awareness that information from last week might not be accurate anymore. The most common sources for information were weather forecasts, agency websites, and posted signage. And the least common were outdoor interest groups, radio stations, and national forest helplines. And next slide. So intended visitation to these areas significantly drops when there's an active wildfire burning in the area, probably a good thing. We got a lot to manage already without an influx of visitors. But it also significantly drops when there's smoke in the area, which we all know can be common in these locations, and that's likely to have impacts on local economies, especially local economies that really rely on outdoor recreation. One thing we found interesting was asking folks in Flagstaff about red flag days. About half of the days we were surveying were red flag days. And some of the folks we surveyed said, I wouldn't be out recreating during a red flag day, but it actively was one. I think that this just highlights social desirability in a survey like this, and it's a challenge of studying the public. It might also be indicative that folks don't actually know what a red flag day is. I also want to point out that campfire bans aren't hugely influential on intended visitation. Earlier literature does point to the ability of having a campfire being pretty important to the recreation experience, but our findings somewhat contradict that. So next slide, please. Speaking of campfires, about 1 in 3 visitors were having a campfire, and then there were a lot of variations by site. I think this really is just indicative of the fire restrictions that were put in place. Flagstaff was in stage 2, Jemez stage 1, and Camino Real had no stage restrictions in place. But of those folks having a campfire, 2/3 of visitors also had a shovel, and 83% had at least 5 gallons of spare water. So, I know we want those numbers to be 100, but I think that's pretty good. There's also a spirit of personal accountability in our findings. Over 90% of respondents believed that they knew how to mitigate their own ignition risk and that every visitor is responsible for every fire they ignite. And then 87% said that they would report someone being irresponsible with fire. And this is just something to consider during a forest closure, is that you do lose those eyes on the forest and really have to rely on folks out on patrol or other employees during those times. I think we can go to the next slide, please. So we gave folks an 18-item list of common prevention strategies and asked folks how effective they thought they were. We then ran a factor analyses on those responses to see if there were any patterns in the way folks answered. And we found that folks really seemed to align themselves with one corner of the prevention triangle, but there's still a bit of a gradient. So for example, we can see that the engineering group also found large fines to be effective, which seems like and absolutely is an enforcement strategy. Many of these engineering strategies aim to reduce the risk of ignition spread, but still allow for that activity. So these strategies really encourage and rely on the responsible use of fire without completely prohibiting it. So that's kind of how we lumped that engineering group. But likewise, the enforcement folks really found the enforcement types of strategies to really be effective, and similarly with education. Next slide, please. So what were some of the characteristics of each group? Well, folks in the enforcement category were most likely to be white. Folks in engineering were more likely to be having a campfire and more likely to be camping. Folks in education were more likely to partake in recreation associated with safety classes. So think things like boating requires boater safety, OHVing, and they were also least likely to be camping. There was another group that we called undecided. These folks didn't have much variation in their perceived effectiveness of different strategies, which led us to believe that they were perhaps less aware or knowledgeable of prevention efforts in the Southwest. They were more likely to be female and thought efforts like providing shuttle buses and increasing the number of languages prevention info was presented in were more effective than the other groups. And those two, specifically things like shuttle buses aren't, commonly viewed as prevention strategies or necessarily what you would think of when you would think of a really effective prevention strategy. So that also kind of led us to believe that these folks are more middle of the ground on all of the strategies, not leaning towards one or the other being, much more effective. Next slide, please. So these groups also really closely aligned with survey location. Folks in Flagstaff and Camino Real were most likely or most commonly fell into the enforcement group, while folks from Jemez more commonly fell into the engineering category. And remember, folks in Jemez were much more likely to be camping, which was also an indicator for folks falling into that engineering group. So that makes sense as well. Next slide, please. So wrapping things up with some takeaways, evaluating local usership might create an opportunity to tailor district level prevention strategies and the way they're communicated. There's not a one size fits all approach to pretty much anything, and prevention is not unique to that. So developing a constellation of strategies that reflects local users is likely to result in more effective resource allocation relative to risk. And given that the undecided group was mostly female, there appears to be a need to continue increasing equity and inclusion in prevention education, and incorporating more female-dominated spaces like ladies' bike night or something similar, and also a renewed focus on bilingual materials. Finally, it's important to meet folks where they are at. The majority of folks we surveyed were not local to the immediate area, and I think that just shows that fire prevention has to start at home. So partnerships and coordination between agencies, local governments, and other relevant organizations is necessary for consistent, accurate messaging that reaches beyond local residents. And some prevention work is done behind the scenes through word of mouth at bars or at storefronts, and recognizing that as prevention education and really tapping into that space can increase fire awareness out in the forest, which I think is what we're all aiming for. And that wraps me up.
Great. So the last case study we have to share is a series of focus groups with different members of the public and local practitioners around stage restrictions, including forest closures. There surprisingly hasn't been any research on this topic, just from kind of a social standpoint. Before I get too far into this, just want to make sure we're on the same page about what stage restrictions are. So they're a tiered approach to increasingly restricting the kinds of activities that we can allow on public lands. Stage one tends to be that these activities are still allowed, but in certain areas, like a campfire can be in a designated campsite, but nowhere else, or a developed campsite. Stage two is when those activities start to be prohibited. And then stage three is where the access is rescinded as well. So that's a full forest closure. And these are often used by federal, state, local, county governments to kind of minimize the likelihood of ignition during peak fire conditions. So we used that hotspot map that Zonda shared, and we also worked with our partners to identify a few locations for this. So we ended up with Flagstaff, Los Alamos in New Mexico, and Payson, Arizona. We had 13 focus groups with 108 participants, and we did keep members of the public and professionals separate so they could kind of talk openly if they needed to. At the beginning of these focus groups, we kind of asked, well, who are we worried about bringing this human ignition risk into this area? And really quickly, people would point to urban areas, Albuquerque and Phoenix, as being the big drivers, people coming up and maybe having a different relationship with the land and therefore treating fire differently in these places. There was also a bit of conversation about the fire culture you grew up in, that the East Coast has a very different fire culture, that international visitors might not have enough knowledge necessarily about fire. So the immediate perception was the risk is coming from outside the community. But at some point in every focus group, people started to say, yeah, when I was a kid, I played with fire on the forest, or I saw my neighbor doing something kind of crazy the other day. So there was an awareness that locals do bring risk. It was just that the risk from outside was a bit higher, or perceived as higher. The other group we talked about a lot was non-recreational campers or houseless populations, folks who are living on the forest, not necessarily voluntarily. And the conversation around this was kind of split. There was a concern that these folks could go really deep in the forest, and if a fire started out there, it's going to take a long time to respond. But on the flip side, these folks are living in the forest is their home. They can be really responsible with fire. And in a Flagstaff focus group, they mentioned that houseless populations were calling in ignitions and acting as initial attack. So they can be really beneficial when we're trying to knock down a fire fast too. Once we started talking about stage restrictions, in all of these focus groups, there was immediate overwhelming support for stage restrictions. And in particular, the public really, really liked closures. I think because they lived there and they wanted to see that land protected. So in those resident conversations, people would say, well, how come we can't use forest closures and stage restrictions more often? A lot of people said May 1st, we should be in stage restrictions. So there's a little bit of confusion about how they're implemented there. There's also a little bit of a blurred line about who the rules apply to. If you live there or you're on an inholding in national forest, well, that's your backyard. Surely it doesn't apply to you. Or you're biking, and that's a lot less risky than having a campfire. So there was some different interpretations of this. The other thing that came up a lot was a financial misconception that when the Forest Service closes the forest, they make money or they don't lose money at least. The reality is it's all hands on deck. People are all kind of focused on forest closure, so projects get behind. So in these focus groups, the kind of takeaway was the public want more restrictions. Managers kind of see it as a last resort because of the work and the challenges identifying remote ignitions, things like that. That disconnect came about in two ways. The first one was in this phase of enacting the stage restriction, having a decision around when we go stage 1, 2, 3. And residents had a bit of uncertainty around how the decision was made, what are the metrics, what actually motivates that decision. They were really interested in hearing more, seeing more data around that. And also there was confusion about who makes the decision. A lot of folks thought it was exclusively made at the local level, so they were frustrated that stage restrictions didn't happen immediately when they wanted to see it. Others thought, well, is it regional or Washington office decision? So this uncertainty about who makes the final decision actually was causing a bit of distrust or friction. The other place this showed up was in the enforcement once we decided to go into stage restrictions. A little bit of confusion about the difference between stage 1 and stage 2, and I think this comes about because they can transition so quickly from stage 1 to 2. What you're communicating yesterday might not be what you're communicating about today. But there were also a few interesting kind of loopholes or interpretations of stage restriction language. So here's a quote from Flagstaff focus group. Professional told us they find folks building their own campfire rings out in dispersed camping areas and declaring that that was now a developed campsite, therefore they were allowed a campfire there. So the last thing we talked about in these focus groups was, well, what do you want to see more of? How could we support stage restrictions further? There was a lot of conversation about, well, if the risk is really coming from urban areas or folks from outside the area, we need to reach them before they travel, just like Sarah's survey showed. So thinking about media campaigns, signage, things that start in urban areas and get them to change their behavior before they visit, rather than getting there and realizing what they can and can't do and maybe trying to get away with it anyway. Residents were also really excited about being involved, or very willing. They wanted to engage in prevention, but it manifested in different ways in each location. So in Flagstaff, folks wanted to know the hotline number to call in when they saw stuff. And they were also willing to pay additional taxes or fees like trailhead, parking fees, as long as that fund went towards fire prevention locally. In Los Alamos, there was a lot more interest in kind of educational volunteers at trailheads, key day use areas, especially on holidays. So they kind of wanted that educational approach. And in Payson, there was a lot of just do what needs to be done, approach someone at a campsite if you see it, or patrol the forest on your ATV. So some really different approaches here. A few things to tie up this case study. So we notice that stage restrictions and closure support is way higher than maybe the literature would suggest, at least for folks who live in these areas. And I'll say a limitation of the study is that it was only people who lived in these areas. If we ask visitors, it might be a different conversation, but they're hard to get to sit down for a focus group. So that's an area that needs more research. This comment that urban or non-local visitors are bringing more risk was shared everywhere, but there's actually not a huge amount of data to our knowledge that demonstrates that that's true. It's very anecdotal. So if we want to kind of be strategic about investing in prevention, we need to find out if this is true so that then when we make those investments in education in urban areas, it's actually reaching the right people. We now know communicating the how and the who are really important to building trust, especially around forest closures and when we make the decisions on how and when those happen. We know that we could leverage the public a lot more. They're willing partners. And I think the caveat here is that we need to be cautious so we don't have a lot of vigilante prevention specialists running around. And that also, if we can kind of monitor or manage the ways that that is done, could inform some of that data collection too. And I think the big question at the end of a lot of these was how do we get funding or support for these campaigns, these broader prevention efforts that go beyond our district or our area? Okay, I'm going to speed us through some high-level project takeaways here just to wrap us up. Across all of these different pieces, and we only shared a couple of them today, we're really noticing that that prevention is kind of really underestimated. It does so much. It brings so much value, and yet it receives little funding. We know it works, but it kind of gets overlooked quite a lot. So there's a lot of space to support prevention and continue to celebrate its impact moving forward. We know that prevention is cheaper than suppression. So this question about how we tip the scales is really important. And I think one of those conversations is what do policymakers or decision makers need in order to invest more in prevention? And then how do we collect that data to help them explain why they made that decision? This consistent theme about how we demonstrate prevention success keeps coming up. And I think a piece of this is really about continuing to improve on how we record humiliation data. Monitoring that progress can tell the story, but there does need to be some maybe selection of locally based metrics or other considerations that prevention staff can use to demonstrate their impact too. We know that the public are supportive and ready to engage, which is great. So thinking about ways we can leverage that. Across all of these studies, we can see that it really varies what prevention strategies are needed in each location. So there's definitely a piece of tailoring that happens here. And those models, things like Whoops apps, they're all great, but they have 10 times more value when you bring in a local fire prevention staff member who knows the land and has seen these trends that aren't captured in the models. So that local knowledge is still absolutely essential to this. And the last thing I'll say is we need way more research on specific prevention strategies. We don't know anything about social media impact. We don't know stuff about electronic signage because they didn't exist in the 80s when this research was happening. So there's a lot more room to run on this topic, and I think there's probably a lot of regional variation too. Okay, I think we have time for questions here.
All righty, thank you all so much for those excellent presentations. And we do have plenty of time, so folks who have questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. I'm just going to start in sort of chronological order. So starting with you, Xander, in your presentation, you mentioned that your findings of top causes of human emissions have been useful to various dispatchers and dispatch units. Can you just expand on how specifically they have used that information? Sorry, Xander, you're muted.
Classic. So the dispatch units develop prevention plans, and the sort of top causes fed into priorities within those plans.
Okay, great, short and sweet. Okay, Gabe or others. Just wondering, what is the trade-off between the standardization of prevention education through the WPSAPS tool and the potential loss of local nuance? So what's the trade-off? And then has the tool been updated and better supported to incorporate local information and innovation?
Yes. Okay. So I'd be really happy to speak to that. Um, the Whoops Apps tool is a great platform for tracking, year to year accomplishments and looking at it spatially and using kind of the existing data on these prevention interventions to create that plan and then track it from year to year. What did you get done? What is the like estimated reduction of ignitions associated with that prevention intervention. So it creates a really helpful structure for the type of kind of data that we need to evaluate prevention success going forward. So it is the gold standard for that. And also it is led by a technician or a specialist in some cases that is, has that local knowledge. So there will always be that kind of perspective of that local practitioner on how they structure their programs. And they are able to build that into the types of interventions that they build into their prevention plan in Whoops Apps. So there is a lot of that space for the local knowledge. I just think that there's some of that does exist in the kind of the mind of the technician. I did a training on Whoops Apps. It's been a while, but in my sense, some of those things, of course, are more narrative or difficult to include into kind of a more structured plug and play tool. And I think that's just the nature of using a kind of a one size fits all framework across the country. But those technicians carry that local knowledge, and I think as long as we have that kind of broad spatial planning tool utilized by a local practitioner or folks that have that kind of on the ground awareness, we're going to be in really good shape. And it's heartening to see that the emergence of Whoops Apps and the use of kind of this tool to track from year to year, because I know in years past, there wasn't a consistent approach to prevention planning, and that was kind of a bit of a gap that folks had pointed to. So.
Yeah, if I could add to that as well, a lot of the interviews when we talked about Whoops apps, folks said it was a great long-term planning tool, but it didn't help them with the day-to-day. And I'll also say it's kind of a decision support tool model. There's a lot of research that shows people use those to gut check what they already think they need to do. And for those more experienced prevention stuff, we saw a lot of that gut checking of like, I already know what I need to do. I've worked here for 10, 20 years. I'm going to put it in to confirm it and to get that funding. Whereas the newer folks or the folks who are just getting started didn't have as much experience. It was a really, really valuable tool in those spaces. So I think the local knowledge really comes into validating what comes out of Whoops apps and then the day-to-day interactions and decisions they made on a daily basis rather than an annual as well.
I just want to say one more thing, kind of piggybacking off Kat, is that yeah, the utility of the tool being really important for advocating for budgets to internal, fire management officers, for example, for that prevention tech to kind of structure their program and say, here's what we got, here's why I need what I need, and having something to really anchor into. So that's a lot of how it functions. And they may have already done those same things with or without Whoops apps, but it gives them something to use to advocate for their program and funding through a more kind of structured approach.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that really excellent answer. So Sophia asked, has there been research on perceptions of fire prevention and mitigation messaging regarding emissions on private or municipal land rather than federal public land?
I think the answer is no, regrettably. There's the messaging piece of fire prevention is super understudied, and the studies that do exist with that kind of psychological perspective, they're from back in the 70s, and they'd show people different signs and go, do you like this sign with 3 words underneath or without? And then what do the 3 words mean to you? So they were very, very basic. They did it kind of focus group style in California. Um, and there hasn't really been a lot of conversation about, well, is messaging different on private versus public? So I think, especially in those districts that Sandra showed where like burning on private property is a big driver or any kind of burning as a driver, like those are the places we should do those studies and test that. And a focus group format would probably be great for that. So if you want us to come out, or you have ideas about what that would look like, we'd love to hear them.
And that's a great reminder for me. I will be putting all of the presenters' information in the chat since we're approaching the top of the hour.
I just want to touch on that one more thing is there was some work by Wills de Grand Prix, who's a part of this as one of Kat's students, who did look at like communication from private businesses. I mean, it's not so much about private lands, but partnerships with folks who sell firewood, for example, or signage at like a local brewery. I'm probably butchering some of the kind of takeaway from that, Kat, but I
It
remember
was Sarah. We should
Oh,
get Sarah
Sarah.
to speak on it.
Sorry about that, Sarah. Please.
No
I thought it
problem,
was
no
Will's.
problem. Yeah, and I kind of feel like that gets at the next question in the chat. Sorry to take your job, Rachel, but yeah, I did some work in the Flagstaff area talking to local business owners about how they engage with fire prevention information. And a lot of them did in like a more informal way and were just really motivated to do so because, it's also their backyard, it's home. And that was kind of what I was getting at with there's like a big network of informal partnerships that happen in these areas because, everyone's impacted by every ignition out here. And also local tourism departments. There's some engagement there with places like Discover Flagstaff. They put out a lot of materials with slogans like stay and play responsibly, things like that, and usually link towards fire prevention information, fire restriction information from the city. I think that, I haven't dove into this too much, but for things like transportation departments, I think that they're keyed in mostly with the overhead signage. And it seems like they're always kind of willing to, at least on the I-17 headed north to Flagstaff, make announcements with overhead signage related to fire restrictions or active incidences, especially when it's like smoke on the highway, things like that. But yeah.
All righty, and we are right at the top of the hour, so we'll be wrapping up. But I did just want to squeak in this last question, which relates to partnerships. Teresa asked, did you have any interactions with national fire prevention education teams during this work?
Unfortunately, we did not. We worked most directly with Region 3 on this. I think that would be a great place to expand, and we're actively seeking opportunities to continue this work now that this project is done. I think it would be really interesting to, I know there's folks out there who are following around incident command teams. It would be great to do something similar with these prevention teams and follow them around and kind of see where they get pushback or challenges, how they're utilized, and then the impact on those districts or areas afterwards. So that's another place. I think we just didn't have a connection when we got started on this, but would love to do something like that in the future.
Alrighty, well, that is our time. Thank you all so much for your really excellent presentations on years of work. And I'm happy to see this out in the world and excited to see what comes next, since I'm sure there will be more. So Gabe, Kat, Sarah, and Xander, thank you. Thanks to everyone online, and we'll see you for the next one. Take care.
Thank you.